Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Now, before I introduce the event and introduce the writers that I have with me here today and also introduce myself, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Now, I'm joined here by Melanie Cheng and Omar Sakr. But before I introduce these amazing writers, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If we could all just please switch our mobile phones to silent. I believe the Wheeler Centre is okay with tweeting, although I do see a lot of Wheeler Centre events being live tweeted, so I guess the Wheeler Centre is cool with that. The format of this event will begin by me introducing Omar and Melanie, and then we'll have a short discussion. And both the writers have been very kind enough to perform short readings of their work for us. And then after the readings, we'll have another shorter conversation, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. I'm hoping we can have at least 15 minutes for questions, but we might be running a little bit over time due to the nature of, the riveting conversation that I'm sure we'll all be having. So I please ask you, if you do have a question, compose it in your head, and short, sharp, sweet is really good. And hopefully we can get to everybody and nobody will be left not having asked the question that they're burning to ask. Also, books are for sale. The bookseller for this event is Readings, I believe, and Omar and Melanie will be signing books towards the back. I do recommend, if you don't have a copy of both books, or if you are not as fortunate enough to have read it yet, read both of the books yet, I do recommend them. And I do recommend you also get your book signed as well, because everybody loves a signed book. Okay, my name is Khalid Warsami. I'm a local writer, and I'm here today to have a conversation with two amazing writers who I will introduce right now. With me this afternoon is Melanie Cheng. Melanie is a GP as well as a writer, and her debut short story collection, Australia Day, won the 2018 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Fiction. Her new book, Room for a Stranger, is a novel set in Melbourne about the unlikely friendship between an older woman and a young student from Hong Kong. The novel charts a few months in the lives of Meg Hughes, 75 and living alone, and Andy, 22, who is in his second year of university in a new country. The circumstances that have brought them together are utterly ordinary, but the novel is shot through with such compassion and insight that one cannot help but fall in love with them both. Their vulnerabilities, flaws, loneliness, and yearning attain a state of grace that is so rare in fiction, and for which I'm so thankful to have read. Please join me in welcoming Melanie. With me also is Omar Sakr. Omar's poetry has been published in English, Arabic, and Spanish in numerous journals and anthologies. He placed runner-up in the Judith Wright Poetry Prize and has also been shortlisted for the ACU Prize for Poetry, the Storywine Prize, and the Fair Australia Poetry Prize. Omar has performed his work nationally and internationally. He lives in Sydney, and his latest collection is The Lost Arabs, out through UQP. Omar's debut collection is These Wild Houses, and it was critically acclaimed and shortlisted for several awards, including the Kenneth Slessor Prize. Am I saying that right? Kenneth
Sure.
Slessor.
Yeah. I mean, that's enough. I need to make a much shorter.
Well, I think this longer bio is appropriate to your talent and stature.
Thank you.
I want to begin by saying that we have two very different writers. Melanie's a short fiction and fiction writer, and Omar's a poet who has written. You've written fiction before, and you keep on threatening to write a novel, which I'm really excited about.
I like that phrasing, threatening. That's right.
I want to begin by please welcome me in join me in welcoming Omar. I'm sorry. Everybody gets an applause. That's the deal with coming on stage here. I want to begin by acknowledging that both of your works are dissimilar in a lot of ways, and I don't want to get too caught up in teasing out points of commonality between your works. But there is one through line that I feel is worthy of exploring here to kick off this discussion. And that is the way in which both of your books grapple with love and the interconnectedness and perils of love, particularly like familial love and how it's connected with duty and obligation and how all of these swirl about in our lives. I'll start with you, Melanie. Almost all of the characters in Room for a Stranger have been marked by duty, responsibility, and a love that expresses itself in these very practical ways. And these ways are often unknowable to other characters. I'm thinking specifically of the way the protagonist Meg, one of the protagonists, Meg, has lived her whole life caring for the people she loves. And also of Andy and the heart-wrenching scene towards the end of the book that really sheds light on his specifics of his relationship with his father. Can you begin by talking a little bit about that? And I find I find it fascinating how it's really a story about love, but it's not a love story. And I want you to, if you could talk about that, that would be.
Sure. So maybe I'll just give it a little bit of context. So yeah, so Margaret, or Meg Hughes, she's 75 years old. She finds herself living alone now in her family home, the only home she's ever known. She has spent her entire life caring for others. So she cared for her elderly parents until they passed away, and then she inherited the role of caring for her sister who was disabled until she then passed away. And so she lives alone now, apart from her pet African grey parrot, Atticus, who's one of the other key characters in the novel. And she is very much inspired by a real life character in my own personal life, and my aunt, who was a favourite aunt of mine, who found herself also at age 16 in a primary caring role. Her mother passed away, and so she looked after my mother and my uncle until they grew up, and then ended up caring for my grandfather as well until he finally passed away. So she never pursued her own family. She never moved out. She never had that experience of kind of reinventing herself or forging a new life for herself. And I think even as a teenager, seeing her, I was quite taken aback with that level of sacrifice and wondering what that might be like when all the traditional markers of success, a career or a family or, a partner, she wasn't able to kind of participate in that. And yet it struck me that what she did was incredibly meaningful and generous and important even to society, more generally. And then there's Andy, who's the student who takes up a room in Meg's house when she is in search of some companionship and a bit of security. And Andy, while on paper is wildly different from Meg in both age and gender and cultural background, Andy is also motivated by similar, desires to please and to make his parents proud. So he is an international student studying biomedicine at an unnamed university, which is surprisingly similar to Melbourne University. And he is a reluctant participant in this home sharing type arrangement because his family's business collapses in Hong Kong, and while they can afford the tuition on his for his studies, they can no longer afford the rent on his apartment in the city. And so he is kind of forced into this situation to take up residence in Meg's house. But he is, again, although at the beginning of his life and looking towards his future, he is in many ways in the same kind of bind that Meg was, in wanting to fulfill his parents' expectation. He has this huge, burden placed on him. They expect him to try to get into medicine. They are funneling the small amount of money they have into his education. And so I really wanted to explore these two characters who are seemingly so different and yet are in similar binds and motivated by similar, desires and that filial kind of piety.
I wonder why those filial piety and the way we love each other within families, I wonder the ways in which they're inscrutable to us. I find it very strange. I find it very fascinating, not strange, how Andy had no idea how much his father loved him because his father expressed love in a way that he didn't understand. And I find that Meg also goes through life expressing deep affection and love, but the people around her don't really understand that, or particularly her friends don't understand, and probably she doesn't understand that herself when she has her internal dialogue about her relationships. But probably the only person who does understand Meg that way is the parrot who doesn't speak.
Yeah, so there's even a scene where Andy's, on a tram, and he looks at, or he describes looking at an Australian parent kissing the top of a toddler's head and kind of breathing her toddler in. And he laments that he never had that his mother never showed him this outward affection. And so a lot of the affection in his family is through actions, through the fact that they are giving all this money towards his education. And so he does feel that he has missed out in some ways, but to some degree he's idealizing the other as well. And through the journey of the book, he discovers that in fact his parents do love him. They just express it in different ways. And I think that's something that, having grown up in a mixed race household as well, and seeing the different ways that different cultures express emotion, was something that I had some personal experience of as well.
Omar, I feel like love and familial love and also the obligations and duties we have to each other in a family, and how those can be inscrutable in so many ways, and how we struggle to understand it throughout our lives, is something that is a through line through all your work. But I also want to point out that you have your poetry collection is a collection of poetry, and we are, well, that's a silly statement, but also we are we can talk about specific poems, but there's a through line through the whole of your work where I really do, reading your work, I really do feel like I'm being embraced by your poems, and there's profound kindness in your poetry where there's a love being outwardly radiating from the poems themselves, and it's a love that's knowing of who we are and our flaws and pointing it out, but that's the action of love as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, thank you for saying so. Yeah, I think, look, I'm bisexual, and I'm Arab, and I'm Muslim, and I come from a poor and working class family. And this idea of how do we love each other is one that I'm fixated on. Because from a very early age, I had this awareness that there was something in me that made the love that my family had for me conditional. And so from a very young age, I've just had this thought in my head that there's a line to love, and it never made sense to me. For all the various abuses that have occurred in the households that I lived in, I never really stopped loving my family, but I did have to get away from them, right? I had to leave the house to kind of explore that, my queer sexuality and have the relationships that I wanted to have, which I think of as a kind of personal apocalypse, right? You have this idea that the act of loving another person is going to end your world, and family is so important, right? I think particularly to ethnic communities, diasporic communities, because you have nothing else, and you know that the country that you're in doesn't love you. You only have family. And so making that decision to pursue that love, pursue that desire, I should say as well, which is separate to love, will in some way blow up your world. And I've been haunted by that, right? Because it's principally a very selfish thing. And when you come from a poor family, like, the resources are so important and they rely on you so much in so many different ways. It's not necessarily the case where I think for like middle class people who like are used to turning to their parents for help economically, for example. You know, most of my friend group, my family, I think it goes the other way just as much. They need your help. So I try to, kindness is very important, right? Making sure that you're safe is very important. Loving your family no matter what, I think, is very important. But they're not always working together. Sometimes they're at odds. And so I'm in the cracks of all of that. And trying to figure it out in these poems. And what I find is that the further I move away from my family to kind of protect myself, the closer I get to them. I have to, in some way, write these poems and hope that they can act as a bridge, that one day we can cross together.
I want to ask a follow-up question there. By crossing together, I'm really interested in how that would work within your intentions as a poet and as an artist. Is the crossing bring people with you or towards you? Or is it because I feel like there's an outreach going on there.
There is, but it's not something that I'm doing with the expectation that that's going to occur or has to occur, right? And it's not necessarily just for my family. So when I get messages from queer Muslims who tell me how much my work means to them, for example, I know that they crossed that bridge. They knew what it was for. They understood its construction because in some way they're making the same kind of efforts to understand their families and love them no matter what. So, but I have had that experience of like cousins who I haven't spoken to in years sending me a message on Facebook, for example, being like, I saw this viral tweet of yours and I was like, I Googled you and you have a book and that's amazing. And then I read it and it made me cry and it made me realize things about your life that I hadn't known before. And so those moments are always, I feel, kind of miraculous. But yeah, anyone can go across these bridges, can read these poems and arrive at a destination that I hope is kinder and more loving than the place they left.
I think now would be a really good time for both Omar and Melanie to read short excerpts from their work. I'll start with, are you okay with going first, Melanie?
Sure.
And then we'll go over to Omar and we'll continue discussion there.
As soon as dinner was finished, Andy retreated to his room. Meg sat in the lounge, alone, watching The Voice. When Meg had applied to the home share program, she'd been seeking the protection of an extra body, preferably male, inside her house. She'd hoped for somebody quiet, somebody who kept to himself. She'd said as much to the skinny lady with kind eyes at the home share office. But now Meg wondered if perhaps she wanted more than that. Some company, a snippet of conversation, some remedy for the loneliness she'd felt since Helen had passed away. And while she'd slept more soundly these past few nights, knowing Andy was in the next room, now she found herself scrutinizing their interactions. Why didn't he make eye contact? Did he hate her? What did he do for all those hours locked away in his room? Meg had travelled briefly in her 30s before her father died. She'd even stopped over in Hong Kong, where Andy was from, on her way to London to visit her aunt. But that was a long time ago. The glimmering metropolis she saw nowadays on TV was unfamiliar. All she could really remember was the smell, a mixture of rotting vegetables and dead animals and sewage that had flooded the plane like mustard gas as they landed at Kai Tak Airport, and the rage she'd felt on returning to the hotel to discover she'd been pickpocketed, her wallet missing and the bottom of her handbag slashed open like the belly of a fish. Meg decided against sharing such stories with Andy. She didn't want him to think that the only recollections she had of his home were bad smells and petty crime. If anything, having Andy in the house made her realize how little she knew about the world. Her universe, after her parents had passed away, had been the family home and Helen. For years, Meg had listened to Anne and Gillian speak of Paris and Rome without so much as a twinge of envy, and yet now, with the arrival of this quiet student from Hong Kong, she felt a burning curiosity about the world. Meg sat up in her recliner, found her slippers with her feet. She turned off the TV. She hadn't really been watching it. These days, everything was reality television, but the shows were unlike any reality Meg had ever experienced. Home cooks creating masterpieces from gold leaves and salted caramel, people losing 2/3 of their body weight as a woman with a fake tan yelled at them. D-grade celebrities agreeing to live together in a house with no walls and cameras in the bathrooms. Whatever happened to Bandstand and I Love Lucy? Those were the shows she and Helen had watched as teenagers. But they seemed tame and simple by current standards. Meg supposed they couldn't go back to that age of innocence. Not after all the revelations about celebrities like Bill Cosby and Rolf Harris. She supposed they were stuck with people kissing in swimming pools and crying into their tiramisu. Meg accepted this. She only wished they would all do it a little more quietly. Nobody valued silence anymore. If anything, they seemed unnerved by it. She was shocked when she saw young students Andy's age walking around with headphones the size of earmuffs clamped to their temples, unaware if the birds were chirping or the leaves were rustling or a truck was hurtling towards them. Meg turned off the lamp and made her way across the dark room to the hall. Outside Andy's room, she stopped and listened for the creak of a floorboard, the groan of a mattress spring, a snore, but there was nothing. As she walked the short distance to her room, she felt acutely aware of her heavy, hippo-like movements, the beams of the house seeming to crackle like dry kindling around her. When Andy moved out, Meg wondered, would he leave a trace? Or would his presence be as ghostly as a breeze wafting through the dusty hallway? Thank you.
The Meg's voice is really, really a pleasure to listen to because I'm so reading the book. I was so taken by her quiet dignity and her the way she protects herself without shutting herself off. And there's this constant. You don't feel like the two opening oneself to the world and shutting oneself off from the world to protect themselves. You don't feel like they're on the same axis, like she's wobbling between the two. It sort of feels like they exist independently of one another, and that's an incredible something about that ethic of her, the way she approaches the world is, I think, what makes her such a compelling character. Can you talk a little bit about Meg and how she became a person who sees the world that way?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned already, I was inspired by my aunt, who was she hadn't traveled much. Her world was pretty small, but at the same time, she was what I would describe as a warm and open person. And so it means a lot to hear you say that, you know, you got that feeling from Meg's character as well. I think she's fearful of reaching out, but she also wants to do it. And there's a moment in the book where she says sometimes she thinks what people most fear in the world is what they also crave most. And for her, that's, you know, human connection and you know, as you follow the journey of these two throughout the book, they start living very much independently. As I mentioned there, Andy's locked away in his room for hours. And it really takes life circumstances to force them, in a way, to interact. And it's a gradual coming together. And, you know, I've had feedback that people found that to be quite believable. And I think that's what had to happen in their circumstances. They weren't people that were going to go out and grab new friends or join a club to meet people.
The similarities are quite striking. And you get the sense, I kept on thinking about Andy being like, you've got a model in front of you, you've got a person to emulate, but he's so young that he has to make certain mistakes. He hasn't learned how to be open and also protect himself in very specific ways. But he goes through that journey himself, and he learns quite a lot from Meg especially towards the end of the book, without actually explicitly thinking about it in those terms.
Yeah, and that's what I really enjoyed as well, the contrast between Meg being at the end of her life and kind of reflecting on it, and Andy being at the beginning. And, you know, I heard Siri Hustvedt talk recently about life being like a funnel. When you're you're young, the funnel's kind of opening out towards you. The possibilities are, you know, huge. Whereas towards the end of your life, you're kind of at the narrow end and looking back. And I see them as being on these opposite ends. And so it's really important for Andy to learn from Meg, who has had those missed opportunities, which she can't change, which she's growing to accept. But for Andy, that's not necessarily the case. He can change the trajectory of his life.
And you can see that in like even the smallest moments where how he notices on the plane how his father's shoulder touches his, and you get the sense that he wouldn't have noticed that in the beginning of the book. Yeah. And that's just over the course of 3 months. Omar, I think we might ask you to do a quick reading, or a long reading. It's up to you.
Really, really long. Nah, jokes.
Let's read the whole book.
I will read a poem called, if I find it, Factoids. We've gone too far. Factoids. My mother sits in the stone house and she burns. Her father brought his family here to escape history. When she was young, one of 9, he beat them with his father's hands. Later, high on heroin, he became a midnight salesman, selling their jewels and mattresses. I have no way to verify this. My grandparents are both home in the mud. A factoid can be a falsehood or a trivial truth. It is a whole language allows to have 2 spirits. My mother sits in a stone house and she burns. Sometimes she is the stone, sometimes the flame. She does not scream. She is a beacon. I record to use her light as a cudgel and purple this page. I wanted to be an artist once, she said. He wouldn't let me. Her first husband beat her. He was high on heroin. He hit her at home, cracked her skull with a pistol. Now she forgets her name at least once a day. He visited her in the hospital as she lay recovering. He beat her in that bed. I write everything down. My mother sits in a stone house and she burns. The house is a village in Lebanon. The house is in Villawood. There are photos of my mother before all this. Everyone agrees she used to be beautiful. I see her burning, her face and nose and lips curling up into black paper as she does the dishes and goes to work and orders takeaway dinner. There is nothing more beautiful than survival. But I have no one to tell this to. Everyone agrees. The present is an ugliness to be ignored. My mother is not alone in her stone, her fiery wedding dress. Other daughters go up next to her, little infernos. They speak cinder and ash, tongues a brand that see language into body. They tell me family has checkpoints vicious as any country. And not everyone makes it across, or if they do, they lose their names in a calligraphy ablaze. I wish I had asked how to choose between a fist at home and the border, between bruise and bewilderment, or how to live in a place that is both safe and wound, flame and stone. Every word has two spirits at least. My mother survived, and she did not. She can't keep her dreams in. They pour out the hole in her head, a gun left, a man left, life left, this poem left open. My mother sits in the stone house I put her in and burns. She could be so much more. I could tell you of the diamond baked into her tooth, how she made her smile a gem worth weighing. I could say she never arrived from Lebanon, that my grandfather let history burn his body in Tripoli and it saved us, that she drives trucks, knows how to make gelato and is always dreaming up new inventions, or that her dogs make her squeal with joy. Inside my stone house, these things seem trivial or false, but I tell you they are true.
I think listening to you read your poetry, you get the real sense of this feeling that I get when I read your poetry, which is that your poetry is not merely something to be read, it's also something to be felt. And they're not merely physical, but they're also spiritual, and there's a border between physicality and the spiritual life. And I feel like especially this poem, which is one of my favorite poems in the collection, it feels like you're planting a stake in the liminal zones while also rejecting the instability of those zones. And I feel that without truly understanding it the way you don't truly understand the poem, but you sort of get it without quite. I want you to talk specifically about one of those images that you keep on returning to throughout your work, and that zone of instability around language and words and thoughts and speech. And I want to hear you talk about it because I want to lay a small part of the vast tapestry of your work to rest in my own head.
Well, I don't know if I can achieve that, but that's your head. But we'll I'll give it a go, I guess.
We can try.
Yeah, look, I became aware of I feel like I have a responsibility with language and the stories that I tell about myself and my family. And so in that poem, anyway, I'm explicitly addressing how the stories that I tell are also the stories that I heard. The way that family gossip becomes gospel, this kind of cornerstone in your life that you never really question, and the damage, right, that can do. And so I'm always interested, especially in poems, which for me are these what's the word I'm looking for? They're kind of concrete sites of certainty. Each one enacts a kind of certainty, which for me as a deeply anxious person, right, is something that is one of the appeals for it. It's like, in order for me to make a mark on this page, what I am saying has to be said with such conviction that it's going to reach through and knock on the door of someone else's heart.
It's almost like a magic trick where there's so much conviction in the poem, but when you read the poem, you wonder where this conviction can come from in a world that's fragmented and burning, and the scenes that you paint are scenes that there's horrific rendings in your poems, but there's also this certainty, and that's more than anything what I want to know.
Yeah, look, if I had an answer, I think I would stop writing. I don't, but I feel like I feel the need to explore it, and it's a really generative space for me. But that poem as well is, for me, it's like, I don't want people to just think that I'm telling stories about my mum, beating me or neglecting me or enacting these violences on my body, and come away with it with this idea that she's this horrible person. I have to also honor the forces that shaped her, right? She's a product of her environment and a product of the brutalities that were visited upon her by men. And so in that poem, what I'm doing is not just kind of telling this story of her life so that people can understand that I've already done the work to understand her and forgive her, but also to kind of condemn myself, right, for not telling the stories where she's squealing with joy over her dog. She has this love of dogs, which is really unusual for an Arab and a Muslim in particular as well. See dogs as kind of unclean. They're obsessed with cleanliness and hygiene, right? So a dog's a nightmare for them, but she's always had this just irrepressible love of them. And I would remember waking up every morning to hear her having a conversation with our dog. Like, hi princess, how you doing? Stuff like that. But I feel sometimes like I'm a slave to my own pain and to the demons in my life, and so I wanted to try to exercise it as much as I could in that poem.
I think there's I think going back to I sometimes hesitate. Like, the effect of a poem isn't to be healing, but the after effect of the poem can sometimes include that. And I think in some of I'm thinking specifically of the last poem in your collection, which is this very, very, I think it's the shortest in the collection, and it's very tender, and it's very, I think to me it stands in summation, but it's also almost a relief valve for the rest of the collection. I don't know if you want to talk about a specific poem in your collection, but I want to talk about that last poem.
All right. Yeah, look, it's the shortest poem in the book because it was commissioned by the Sydney Writers' Festival, and they told me I had 19 words. So I was kind of like, all right, I'm going to have to work within this very tight constraint. But I think you're right. It was like the one of the last poems I wrote. And it kind of, I wouldn't have been able to write it if I hadn't done all that other work, all that other agonizing, all those expressions of love and cruelty and tenderness. And then finally there was just this kind of acceptance that was enacted through that poem, which, if you haven't read, this is meaningless, but I hope you'll read it and then you'll come back to this and know what we're saying. Yeah.
Melanie, I'm going to do a abrupt shift in what's it called? A segue. I want to talk about the African grey parrot.
Yes.
What a delightful character.
Oh,
I first of all, I have a very specific question about African grey parrots. Do they really know all the? Can they really memorize that much stuff?
Yeah, so my fascination with specifically African grey parrots came from high school. One of my best friends at high school in Hong Kong had one as a pet, and this pet was called Cindy after her cinder-coloured feathers. So they're grey, like mostly grey with a black beak, and they have this flame red tail. And
I looked up a picture. They are
yeah,
quite striking.
they're quite
They're
beautiful.
very
So Cindy used to sing all the theme songs of our favourite TV shows and used to interject with little phrases. And I think I was just, taken with this bird that could speak our language. And I did a bit of research. I had a lot of fun watching YouTube videos with my kids of African grey parrots. And yes, indeed, the most famous one is Alex, the subject of Dr. Irene Pepperberg's research. He had a vocabulary in the hundreds. He could identify colours and shapes, and so they do have amazing intellect.
With the obviously, like the bird interjects throughout the novel, often to humorous effect. But also, I find it fascinating how the bird sort of acts like a barometer it's present in the novel. Doesn't make any sense. Nobody understands what it means. It doesn't understand what it's saying. Exactly. But it's there in the function that it plays in the book. It's a fascinating way. It makes sense in a very specific way. That is really quite. I found it fascinating. I found the bird's life in the story, in the narrative, to be very functional while also being nonsensical at the same time. I don't quite know what I'm saying, but I hope.
So,
I can make a point about the bird.
Sure.
Please
maybe.
do. Yeah.
Since you're fixated on the bird. For me, I want to know what you think about pets in the home, first of all, because it was so striking to me and so funny that Andy saw it and was like, "This is disgusting. There's an animal in here. It's filthy." And she just touches it and then touches her food, and it's like, ah.
That's exactly what. Right? I remember when I was a child and I touched a cat outside, and my mum made me take a shower before I had dinner. And I found that. Yeah, I recognized that so much. It was fascinating.
Well, it's interesting. So this friend of mine from high school, I reconnected with her after writing the book just to let her know that, her pet had been the inspiration. And she commented on how her whole adolescence she'd really struggled with this idea of having this pet bird who should be in the Congo and free and wild. And obviously at the time when we were friends, I hadn't realized that this was going on in her head as well. And I think that also serves a symbolic, purpose in the book, in the sense that Meg and Andy are also prisoners to some degree, prisoners of their own making. And, there is a scene in the book where the bird escapes and is free for a while. So there was a lot of, metaphorical weight to this as well. But in terms of what Atticus says, some reviews have compared him to a Shakespearean fool and others a Greek chorus. And I think my favorite way to think of Atticus is like the toddler, because I have young kids and, they just mimic us and mirror us with also not really understanding what they're saying. But sometimes in those moments, they really make us laugh and kind of draw our attention to the absurdity of what we do. And so that's how, I like to see Atticus.
I think in a lot of ways, animals, that's a function that I think regarding your mum's love for dogs, Omar, I find that we need animals in specific ways that we don't quite understand, but we can readily narrativize in our lives.
Yeah. I maybe have the opposite interpretation. Well, it just seemed to me that like what you were saying was that this animal was a crutch that she was leaning on, and not just leaning on, but that was in such a way that it inhibited perhaps a deeper connection with Andy, right? The bird was between them. I don't want to spoil the story, but literally, literally, it was having a detrimental impact as well. And that's something that I think about with my mum too. Like it was a kind of emotional crutch, a release as well. The only way that she could be that kind of joyful was with an animal that couldn't really speak back, but like she was never like that joyful with me. That warmth was never with me. It was never with my brother or my sister. But that was I'm still thankful and glad that I witnessed it, that she did have one way of expressing it. But yeah, it's complicated with the way that we treat animals, whether we live with them or not, how we love them and how that love can.
I wonder, because Meg bonds with the parrot as a way of also bonding with her sister. I wonder if that worked with you with your mum's dog. Did you bond with the dog as a way of a second order?
No, I mean it was a dog. I loved it. It was like the fluffy, fluffy Japanese Spitz. It was adorable. I mean, I just love the dog. Like the thing about thinking about how my mum interacts with them was kind of a later reflection. But I was a kid. I mean, yeah, I just really simply, basically, non-metaphorically or figuratively love the dog. Like
I think
everything means something, Omar. You're a poet. You should know that.
You're right.
But the love with animals is in some ways also uncomplicated. They don't necessarily test you. I mean,
we can tend to complicate it. We can try to complicate it. But yeah, it's. I was fascinated by it. I think that that parrot was my favorite non-human character in the book. Happened to also be the only non-human character in the book, but that's beside the point.
Sorry, I know we talk about pets a lot, but like, it's not always easy, right? Because I feel like the times that I see people can also be cruel to their pets, like especially if they like unexpectedly poo in the house or pee in the house or do something like that. Whenever they kind of cross over the rules that have been outlined for them, then, and also even with my mum, I could see that extraordinary rage just vault out of her. And I've seen that with other people as well, right? So it's not, I will say that it is definitely easier to love an animal than it is to love a person. But because you're right in saying that they're just these little fluffy balls of warmth. But yeah, I think you can still be cruel to them and
well, what always happens towards the end of these kinds of events is I suddenly have thousands of more. I find myself with even more questions than I came to begin with, but I also find that we're running out of time. We've got enough time for some questions from the audience. So I think there's two volunteers towards the back with microphones. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll have a microphone to you. Yep, right down the middle there.
Melanie and Omar, you both talked about exploration in your talks, exploring ideas and emotions. And Melanie, I want to ask you in respect to your novel, did you know where you were going to go with the novel when you were exploring those ideas that you talked about initially? And Omar, similar to you with your poetry, is that a starting point, or what is your starting point for your work?
Thanks for the question. My starting point is more with the characters themselves, and then of course the premise or the situation that those characters find themselves in. But I don't plan too far ahead. In all other aspects of my life, I'm a planner, but with writing, I'm a pantser, as they say. And so that, for me, that's where the magic of writing lies, in me not knowing what is exactly going to unfold. I feel like if you know your characters really well and you put them in these situations, then you're in a way observing them as you write as well. And yeah, as I said, that's what I derive the greatest enjoyment from.
Yeah, I started writing these poems a few years ago, largely in response to the phrase the Arab Spring, which I kept hearing kind of pronounced by Western commentators in this, like, there was a series of popular uprisings in the Middle East and across the Arab region and African regions, and was said with this such condescension that just drove me absolutely wild, that this idea that, oh, finally, like, these backward savages were finding democracy, as if they hadn't been kept in under these dictatorships with the financial and military backing of the West. It was such a disingenuous framing and a kind of Orientalist propaganda. And I just started thinking about the word Arab and the word spring, what is natural and what is not natural, and this tension between wanting to be able to just write about a flower, for example, and not have to write about these violences, these or political situations. And that got me to thinking about the formation of countries and states and migration and my family's story and how it all fits together. So that's where I started, and that's kind of where I ended up, following that.
Any other questions? I've got a question, Melanie. It's a very short one, but it's about a specific scene in the book which I instantly just lost my mind over. It just went straight to the pleasure centers of my brain, which is when Andy and Kiko bond by recounting racist things that have been said to them by white people. And I found that so funny because I've done that with, like, my friends who are people of color. We're like, oh yeah, this happened to me, and they'll be like, oh yeah, this happened to me, and we bond through that, and it was like really, really. That scene was, well, this is more of a statement than a question, but tell me about tell me about, like, because I found there was a lot of moments in Andy's life that had this very similitude to them that came from recognizable aspects that comes from being an international student from Hong Kong who lives in Melbourne. Tell me about how you assembled the narrative through those scenes, those pivotal sort of, because those scenes all hint at things larger than themselves, but you don't hint at the things themselves, except in very specific cases with a very rude dinner guest. But yeah, tell me a little bit about the process of writing that.
Well, I think with my first book, the short story collection Australia Day, which had its, very much more organic origins, writing stories, not necessarily for a full-length book. So I was playing with whatever my preoccupations were at the time, and when it came to putting that collection together, I realized that, one of my preoccupations was with the notion of, casual racism or episodes of that. And so I did want to kind of explore that in a little bit more detail in the novel. And there is a scene in the novel on a tram where someone is hurling abuse at a group of Chinese students. But rather than be concerned with those very obvious episodes of racism, I wanted to, for instance, that scene, I wanted to explore, well, how does Meg react after that happens? How do all the other people on the tram react in the aftermath of that incident?
How it happens.
Yeah.
It was so true to life.
Well, I think we've all probably, unfortunately, witnessed something like that. And I think if we focus just on the tram man, as I call him, then, we all let ourselves off the hook a little bit because we think, oh, well, I would never do that. I don't know anyone that would do that. But, would we be the other people standing by not saying anything? Possibly. And, if there is any antidote to racism, I think it must have its origins in our ability to reflect on our own prejudices and making those unconscious biases suddenly conscious. And so in that scene with Kiko and Andy discussing those little experiences they have. For instance, like
through the bonding
yeah,
together,
finding it's a kind of a melancholic
Yeah.
joy in some ways. But yeah, you know, for instance, you know, people thinking Kiko's mum, that her Japanese mum is the housekeeper, mistaking her for the housekeeper, or people mistaking Andy for the Korean accountant who lives, you know, 2 floors above him. These kind of things that probably many of us have made the mistake of doing, and just it's like a wake-up moment, I think, that, oh, I have participated in that. I didn't realize that that might have been a cause of offence to someone.
Racism is anything but casual in your collection of poetry.
Okay.
What's the well, I don't want to ask you what you're trying to do, but what are you bearing witness to?
I think, you know, I touched on this just now. Living in a deeply Islamophobic country and world, really, and discourse and popular culture, and one that's also deeply anti-Arab, wanting to do that but also through my own connection to it, right? Like through the personal lens of my family and our history.
And the toll it takes on bodies as well.
And the toll it takes on bodies, yeah, absolutely. You know, when I said earlier that I wanted to honor the forces that shape my mum, that's one of them. You know, we didn't come here for a holiday. Do you know what I mean? Like that was the Lebanese civil war that was occurring over there, and we could go into it, but it's not casual. It is a lot of it is structural violences and that we're talking about. But I wanted to, as much as I could, keep it rooted in my life and the lives of my family members.
We have time for one more question. Is there anybody who's got a question? I think I have a question. So you've both written 2 books, both around similar times and a similar time between your first and second books. Tell me a little bit about
The race.
let's just end with what are you thinking about now? I'm not asking you for the plot of your next book, Melanie, or the title of your next poetry collection or next novel, Omar, but tell me a little bit about what your concerns are these days. What are you whittling away at, and where do you see your next big project heading towards in general terms?
I don't know about you, Omar, but I'm pretty tired after 2 books. No. It's been busy the past 2 years of the 2 books. I read that Helen Garner once said, in response to that question, I'd like to lie in bed for 12 months, lying supine, and I have, you know, some impulse to do that. But I'm focusing now on writing an essay on aging for the Griffith Review, and I'm just going to enjoy maybe writing a little bit of non-fiction. Certainly want to write another novel in the future, but just germinating,
Look
now.
Well, as much as I want you to take a break and have a well-deserved rest, I really am looking forward to reading more of your work, and thank you for sharing it with us, and for all of the sleepless nights that have gone into this novel. We're really thankful for it. What about you, Omar?
Well, we're out of time, I'm afraid. So you'll just have to come to my next event and find out then. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to your next event and your next whatever it is you're doing. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have these 2 amazing writers. Please join me in thanking them. Also, thank you to the Wheeler Centre for putting together this event. It's been a great middle of the day event for those of you who are in your lunch breaks. I hope you go back to work with, you know, plenty to think about, and also like something to like have when colleagues are like, what did you do over lunch? And you can tell them you went to a literary event and heard some people talk, and it was great. And
thank you, Khalid, for moderating this, and to the
And thank you
Auslan
for-
interpreters as well.
Thank you.
For doing a great job.
Absolutely. Omar and Melanie will be signing books. There's also books to be bought at the back there. And that's it from us. Thank you.